Irem, compared to some of the other great Japanese arcade game companies, can perhaps be a little bit slept on. As mentioned in the previous Capcom video, they're the place where that company originally spawned from. Before Kenzo Sugimoto founded Capsule Computers, he founded the company that would become Irem back in the late 60s, initially as a pachinko machine company called IPM, before they made the move to video games in the late 70s, and then changed their name to Irem in 1979 after a complaint from the good old Colossus of Armonk. That being IBM, of course. Nowadays, things have gone back full circle. The original Irem still exists today, and they still make pachinkos. However, this original company totally stopped making arcade games after 1994. Irem Software Engineering, which came later, was a different company created by Nanao Corporation, Irem's parent, that concentrated solely on home games. It can be a little confusing, but today we're concerned with the games made by the original company. And oh boy, what a selection of games we've got. Seriously, there's a whole load of great arcade titles here, and well beyond the ones you're likeliest to know, such as Kung Fu Master and R-Type. The Irem arcade library is one of the absolute best there is, one where even the few titles that miss tend to be at least interesting. There is no reason to just stick to a decade here. We're looking at all the Irem original titles that can be played on MAME, covering a period from 1979 to 1994. There's just under 70 games here, and I'm going to be recommending most of them wholeheartedly. As ever, we are going alphabetically with the odd stop for series of games. And with all that said, well, let's get on with it. We begin proceedings with a sports game, but it's a sport you wouldn't usually expect to see from a Japanese company. Here's 1983's 10-Yard Fight. And can we just take a quick moment to appreciate how flat-out brilliant that title is? It's one of the best examples of the often strange way that Japanese companies use English, and yet it still totally encapsulates the noble art of gridiron. So yes, this is American football, and despite being a pretty old game in the genre, 10-Yard Fight is still very playable. The whole thing revolves entirely around playing as the attacking team. The ball snaps and you either rush or pass, usually the latter. If your pass is intercepted, or you turn over on downs, you get penalised several yards, and while there isn't a traditional scoring system, you basically have to get a touchdown before the time is up in order to advance from the next stage, from high school to the big leagues, all the way to the Super Bowl. Compared to the efforts that you'd find on the likes of the 2600, noble as they may have been, 10-Yard Fight is the first American football game that actually feels like a decent representation of the sport. I mean, sure, it isn't Madden, it isn't Tecmo Bowl, but it's a great arcadified take on it that gets right down to the satisfaction of finding someone in the open, making a pass, and hopefully running that ball into the end zone. One other important thing to note is that Nintendo published the NES version of this title in North America, with Gunpei Yokoi acting as producer. This was one of the NES's launch titles in the territory, which makes sense seeing as it's gridiron. However, unlike the NES version of Kung Fu Master, also an American launch title, Nintendo didn't actually develop the port of 10-Yard Fight themselves. That was done by Irem. We jump all the way to late 1993 for a bit of shooter action. Here's Air Assault, also known as Fire Barrel. This isn't a particularly special top-down shoot-'em-up for the time, in many ways being a rather straightforward take on the very successful Raiden formula, but it's certainly well made, decent graphically, challenging in all the right areas and so on. Although, as is often the case with Irem's games, the Western Air Assault is a little bit easier than the Japanese Fire Barrel. Still hard, mind. It is often the case with Irem that we don't know too much about the people who designed a lot of their games, and we often only have nicknames to go on. For example, this one was designed by a guy called Shaka, who also worked on games like some of the later R-Type titles, including R-Type Delta, and Heavy Nova and Black Hole Assault for the Mega CD. It is often the case with Japanese companies, particularly at this time and especially with Irem, that the coders and makers weren't given proper credits, known only by nicknames that you'd find in the high score list, if they were even credited at all, in order to prevent them being headhunted by rivals. I suppose you can't blame Irem for being extra careful on this front, seeing as Kenzo Sugimoto nicked one of their ace programmers, Takashi Nishiyama, for his new setup at Capcom. As time's gone on, however, we do know more and more. A brilliant person named KNO Industries on Blue Sky, for example, has compiled as much as they know about the people who worked on all of Irem's arcade games, and thanks to things like this, we know so much more than before. It's going to come in very handy as we go along. Air Duel from 1990 is a pretty similar story to Air Assault, a standard and totally acceptable, decent top-down shoot-'em-up where you can either play as a fighter jet or an attack helicopter. However, when it comes to this video, well, this game is perhaps a little more important than Air Assault, as it's our introduction to a group of absolute ace programmers, artists and planners who worked for them, producing a lot of stunning titles in Irem's later years. This is the first game we're seeing here that's made by a team that eventually, after Irem stopped making games, split off and formed NASCAR Corporation. Several guys, including musician Takushi Hiyamuta and coder Kenji Ando, made their debut here, and we've also got Kazuma Kujo in the planner role. Other future NASCAR members did work on earlier games, such as R-Type, but this is the first time that we have a whole bunch together. It's not totally official, but the fact that pieces of music from this game ended up featured in later titles like Gun Force II and Metal Slug 3 pretty much confirms it. In fact, this game is part of a loosely connected quartet of titles known as the Dark Anarchy Society Tetralogy, all of which have similar post-apocalyptic themes and tend to share bits of music and SFX with each other. Air Duel is the first of these games, and later on we'll be seeing Gun Force 2, In the Hunt, and Undercover Cops. This one isn't quite as post-apocalyptic as the others, nor does it stand out quite as much, but you can see a few glimpses of what would become NASCAR's signature style here, particularly in the appropriately gargantuan boss ships that you go up against. As we go through this vid, we'll certainly see plenty of fabulous examples of NASCAR's work. If you know the likes of Metal Slug and Neo Turf Masters, you can spot the work of these guys a mile off, and they never ever miss. Andromeda SS from 1980 is one of a handful of games we can play here from Irem's original guys, International Playing Machine, or IPM Corporation. The majority of IPM's arcade business was in the manufacturing of cabinets, followed by the creation of a few cheaper clones of various more successful games such as Breakout and Space Invaders. And here, in Andromeda, we've got a pretty decent take on Namco's Galaxian, mixed with a bit of Space Invaders. There's a big cluster of aliens, or Andro ships, slowly coming at you, complete with the odd one that breaks away from the pack to take a dive at you, and there's a main ship that constantly disappears in the middle, and as such is pretty damn tricky to hit. It's fine. Not anything original, obviously, but it's got a lot of colours flashing around and presumably it was something for a thriftier operator. It's like Galaxian, but not totally all the way like it. An enjoyable few minutes of play. Atomic Boy, also known as Wily Tower, hails from 1984, and it's a slightly Donkey Kong-esque platform game. In other words, one where you've got to make it to the top of the stage, jumping over obstacles and enemies along the way. In this instance, the obstacles are robotic in nature, and as you're climbing you will need to flick various switches in sequence. You can also jump on generator switches that will send out a pulse to fry those bots, if necessary. It's not exactly the most interesting title, really. Probably the most intriguing thing about it is that it was released in 1985 as Atomic Boy in the States by a very short-lived and obscure company named Memetron, whatever, who also handled American releases of 10 Yard Fight, Taito's Shanghai Kid, and Capcom's Exodexes, which they rechristened Savage Bees. A pretty average game. The Battle Road, also from 1984, is another case of Irem releasing a game that's not necessarily a totally original affair, one that's certainly quite heftily inspired by bigger arcades. This top-down driving game, complete with the ability to shoot opposing cars who are going to take you on, is pretty clearly a take on Midway's hugely successful Spy Hunter from the previous year. Essentially, it's Spy Hunter, but a little bit simpler on the control front, a bouncy theme that's a bit like a Jimmy Hart version of Peter Gunn, and with more cartoony graphics kicking around, the same sort of graphics and assets that you would find in Irem's earlier Zippy Race. It's not a bad take on Spy Hunter by any means, even if there's nothing original about it, and it's nowhere near as iconic as the original title. One of the main differences is that the game is split up into different courses, as opposed to being one long continuous stage, and you get a gas meter as opposed to lives, which naturally goes down faster whenever you get shot or you crash. This kind of makes it a bit easier than Spy Hunter. To be honest, it's a pretty likeable affair. Blade Master from 1991 concludes this little part where there's mostly unoriginal titles. Here we have a hack and slash beat 'em up known as Cross Blades in Japan, where you play as either Roy or Arnold, grab your weapons and defend your kingdom from all sorts of monsters. Yep, it's Irem does Golden Axe, in other words. While we've got some undeniably decent looking backgrounds here, you can mostly count on Irem to be pretty bloody good on the graphics front, to be honest. I wouldn't say that this is a hugely essential game. It's a much more shallower game than Golden Axe, and neither character has a whole lot of moves at their disposal. I don't know, I suppose I was expecting there to be a bunch more abilities available, like running, fancy backslashes and whatnot, magic maybe, considering what Blade Master's ripping off. Not too much more than a mediocre slasher, I'm afraid, and something like this is hardly going to stand out in 1991. These next two games should be a bit more familiar. Why, it's Bomberman! Irem were responsible for 2 arcade titles in the Bomberman series, which naturally they made under license from Hudson Soft, and this introduces another little common theme for Irem, games that actually started out on consoles or computers that Irem lended arcade versions of. You don't often see this sort of thing, but for Irem it resulted in a few of their most successful arcade games. Their first Bomberman game from 1991 isn't exactly going to offer any surprises. It's faithful to exactly what Bomberman was at the time, essentially being an arcade version of Hudson's PC Engine game from the previous year, complete with a more regular adventure mode, and a battle mode that can be played either against the computer or other humans. And yes, there's the usual power-ups. Increase the power of your bombs, increase the amount of bombs you can put down, and obviously avoid the skulls if you can. It's Bomberman, and obviously it's good. This was still the time when the games in the series tended to go by different names outside of Japan, mind you. So in the US this was Atomic Punk, cool title, and in Europe it was Dynablaster, shit title. Bomberman World from 1992? Yeah, pretty much more of the same. This second arcade title is apparently notable for being the first time that all the Bombermen were referred to as being brothers, if you're at all interested in Bomberman lore, and you probably shouldn't be because that could end up resulting in Bomberman Act 0. Anywho, you pick either the battle or the normal mode, and then go at it in the usual way. This second game was known as either New Atomic Punk Global Quest or New Dynablaster Global Quest in the States and Europe respectively, and obviously the theme in the regular adventure is travelling through different countries. I like Bomberman absolutely fine, and it's obviously one of the all-time classic party games, although I'm definitely a lot more interested in playing it with other people than I am interested in trying to take out more traditional enemies and what have you. Demoneye-X hails all the way from 1981, and it's more single-screen shooter action, and a pretty good one too. Again, it's somewhat in the Galaxian vein in that you've got a bunch of little ships, or space demons in this instance, at the top that come flying down at you, but this time you've also got a big boss eye creature where said weird demons are spawning from, and you'll eventually fight that eye once its supplies are exhausted. There's an enjoyable weird vibe here thanks to the demons, and the play itself is typically solid. Certainly not a famous Golden Age shoot 'em up at all, but it's worth a little play. Kind of funny how, almost at the same time, there were two very similar horizontal shooters in which you're put in charge of a dragon, both of which share a bunch of unique mechanics even if they are quite different. When we look at Jalico, whenever that comes, we'll be having a go at 1989's Saint Dragon again, and a damn good game that is too. But for now, and also from 1989, here's Irem's Dragon Breed, and that's also a damn good game. The core mechanic these games share is that most of the dragon's body is invincible, only the head is vulnerable, and you can use the rest of the body as a shield with the right positioning. I love this mechanic, it must be said. Really makes you pay attention to how you're moving about, especially as there's a lot of shots coming your way. Dragon Breed does have a big difference, mind. Here you're actually in control of a hero named Caius, who's riding atop the dragon, named Bahamut, and you can even dismount the dragon at points to quickly collect power-ups and the like. Obviously risky stuff, but very fun to do. Both Dragon Breed and Saint Dragon are fabulous games, and honestly it's a bit tricky for me to pick one. Dragon Breed definitely has the graphical edge, as you're in control of a much bigger dragon, and the general quality here is just stupid levels of good. But, I prefer playing Saint Dragon. Perhaps that's a little bias as I've played that game a lot more, and it's one of my immediate go-to underrated arcade people need to play a lot more of picks. But if I had to choose one, I would go for Jalico's game. Obviously you should just go and play both of them. Now this next one isn't actually strictly an IRM game, but it should be included here. Dream Soccer 94. As a matter of fact, we've looked at this game once already in the Data East 90s arcade video, but work on this game did actually start at IREM. However, the project wasn't completed when Naneo pulled the plug on IREM's video game development, and so Data East licensed the game and completed it. This is pretty typical arcade football. It's not bad, but it's no Football Champ or Super Sidekicks. Some things I like include some of the lovely pictures that you get whenever someone scores, most probably the work of the almighty Kinte, who we'll get to more later, and the very silly commentary, which mostly consists of someone shouting a country's name at the top of their lungs whenever they get past the halfway line.
They're on the attack! They're on the attack! They're on the attack!
Other than that, it's pretty so-so, and it does feel somewhat rough around the edges, especially when there's a header or a volley. Chances are the game perhaps wasn't all the way finished, considering the circumstances of its release. Average sports game and the only football game that we're going to be seeing in this video. Aside from American football, which we saw earlier.
They're on the attack!
Up next, we go all the way back to 1980 for Green Beret. And yes, this is a totally different game from Konami's title of the same name. Seems obvious to say that, but Konami's game is one of the reasons why this is possibly the most obscure arcade in the whole Irem library. Firstly, it obviously wasn't successful to begin with, and secondly, there wasn't a playable dump of this game kicking around for a long time, being on MAME but not playable. The almighty MAME Haze has some details here. For years, any PCB of this game that he'd managed to track down had ended up scrapped, usually because they were faulty, and as they didn't work, people just assumed they were broken bootlegs of Konami's game. They chucked them. Eventually though, a second PCB was found in collector Frank Palazzolo's basement. This one was also bad, but bad in a different way. And so, you combine the original bad PCB's dump with a new dump from the new bad PCB, and from there, you end up with a playable ROM dump and a preserved game. Kind of grossly simplifying the process there, but there you go. Also, the game is kind of decent. It's a top-down tank shooter where you've got to take out the enemy fortifications, and it is quite difficult, mainly because the tank's movement is actually quite realistic for a 1980 game, and you can't just turn in any direction you want. You have to think a little about it. A toughie, but likeable. These next two games aren't hugely well known, but they're absolutely excellent and actually quite important. It's the two Gunforce games. The first one, from 1991, has the very cool full title of Gunforce Battlefire Engulfed Terror Island, and it's a pretty nice Contra-style run and gunner, complete with the typical range of weapons such as bazookas and flamethrowers, and also the ability to get into the odd vehicle here and there. As with most of these games, you die in one hit, and you do get a pretty recognisable death scream whenever you fall. Now, this first game is all well and good, and it performed reasonably okay, actually, but the second title is the one that deserves more attention. Gunforce II, also known as Geostorm in Japan, came out in 1994 and it was, in fact, the very last arcade game released by the original Irem. The run-and gunning action is still present, but everything is now absolutely frickin' massive. Loads more vehicles, bullets flying everywhere, rocking tunes, epic and huge boss battles. Ugh. Now, I don't know about you, but all of this feels a bit familiar to something else. You've probably guessed that this title was made by the guys that would make up Nazca Corporation, and Gunforce 2 absolutely feels like a precursor to Metal Slug. Metal Slug Zero, if you will. As mentioned when we did Air Duel, Gunforce 2 is part of the DAS tetralogy, along with that game, In the Hunt and Undercover Cops, and it's certainly got a lot more of the post-apocalyptic shenanigans going on. Anyway, there's a lot of touches here that you will find in Metal Slug. The aforementioned vehicles, rescuing hostages and picking up other bonuses, grungy, cartoony graphics, and a bit of humour. It's all there, and this game is absolutely brilliant. If you like Metal Slug, then you absolutely need to play this one, and even if you're not too familiar with that series, you should also play it, as it's just a flat-out superb run and gunner. While it's a shame that Irem decided to leave the arcade behind, Gunforce 2 was a damn fine way for them to sign off, and we wouldn't have Metal Slug without it. Up next, it's 1990's Hammerin Harry. This is the first game in the Harry series and the only one that would be in the arcade, but even if the series is mostly known for console games, this here is a damn good debut, and the Japanese title has got an awesome translation. It means Mr. Jen the Carpenter, Bloody Fall Town Riot Chronicle. As the title suggests, you are Harry, and you're defending your town from groups of idiotic construction workers who seek to cause trouble and generally screw it all up, tearing it down to the ground and presumably replacing the previously nice place with, I don't know, a whopping great pachinko parlour. Whatever. In short, they're paving paradise and putting up a parking lot unless you twat them with the mallet. The game plays nicely, but in the main it's quite a funny title, one with lots of amusing enemies and a little bit of satire kicking around here and there, as well as a lot of voice samples. It's lovely stuff, and it is most certainly very Japanese, to the point where it is perhaps surprising, in a good way, that it got a Western release, let alone one that didn't even really change all that much about the game. Hasamu from 1991 is a pretty minor game. This one's got the old solitaire Shanghai thing going on, but it's slightly different to the norm as you are occasionally allowed to move tiles about, and you can get rid of a bunch of tiles all at once if you match two tiles of the same suit that are in the same row. Different to the more regular sort of game where you've got a whole load of tiles to play with and a time limit that you increase with the addition of more credits, although I have to confess that I am pretty bad at this. I don't know, I just couldn't get past the second level. There's probably something about this twist on the concept that I'm not quite getting. Hey ho, it's inconsequential arcade fare. Here's another game from the early days. It's Head On. What, Head On as in the Sega game? Yeah, pretty much. It's a game by Irem called Head On from 1979, the exact same year that Sega released Head On. And yeah, this is virtually the same game, albeit running on different hardware. Now, in case you've never seen this was a very successful game where you're a car, you drive around a track, collecting dots, and try not to collide with the other cars. Probably something that's most famous nowadays for heavily inspiring Pac-Man, and this is a perfectly okay version of the game. But, well, what gives here? How exactly did IPM make this and not just get sued to oblivion by Sega? And the answer does lie in this being a very different time. It's not as if copyright wasn't enforced, but IPM actually did get the license from Sega to make a clone of their successful arcade game. And they weren't the only ones either. Even the almighty Nintendo themselves got a license to release their clone of Head On. So why do such a thing? Well, the game centres probably demanded it more than anyone else. Video arcade games were all the rage thanks to Space Invaders, and, well, they just wanted games. Games out the wazoo. It didn't really matter at this point just how many versions of something like Space Invaders or Head On or Breakout or whatever were on the floor. In all likelihood, they were all going to get played aplenty, and Sega and other companies were happy to sell a license to make a clone to others, presumably taking a share of that clone's profits. In a few entries' time, we'll see the first successful IPM arcade game, that being IPM Invader. And just like in the case of this game, IPM Invader was a crude clone of Space Invaders, running on different hardware, but IPM did get a license from Taito to create it. Now, of course, there would be unofficial clones of games kicking around in the market before too long, and that's when studios would start to flex a bit of copyright muscle. For now though, well, something like this completely blatant clone of a much more successful game is actually not as illicit as it might seem at first glance. Here's something much newer, and it's a licensed game. Steven Spielberg's Hook had a pretty wide selection of games, it has to be said. You've got a perfectly okay Western 8-bit platformer, a really frickin' good Japanese 16-bit platformer, an odd little point-and-click that your mileage may vary on, and you've got this 1992 arcade beat-em-up. While the Mega Drive and SNES Hook is definitely the best one, IREM's beat-em-up is totally decent, and takes second place. It's a much better belt scroller than Blade Master, that's for sure. As you might expect, the game involves playing as either Peter Pan or a couple of the other Lost Boys, and taking a bunch of villains to the cobblestones over various levels, complete with a few neat set pieces here and there. If you're not a fan of arcade beat-em-ups, well, this won't change your mind. Hook is a perfectly fine effort. That said, we are going to have a couple of all-time great beat-em-ups later on in this video, so this certainly isn't the best that Irem can do in the genre. Image Fight from 1988 is another pretty strong shoot 'em up. This time we're going vertical, and the game takes a few cues from the absolute monster successful shooter that the company released in the previous year, that being R-Type. Now that is perhaps not too surprising really, as both games share the same lead designer, a man nicknamed Abiko. The main cues from R-Type come in the way that the game allows you to play with options and in the wide variety of weaponry that is at your disposal. There's so many different option weapons dotted throughout the game, so many that it would be quite a challenge just to see them all. And of course, it's a stupidly difficult title. It may be even harder than R-Type, especially seeing as those option weapons, unlike R-Type's Force Pod, will be destroyed as soon as they take a hit. So yeah, this is definitely not a game for the faint of heart, or the easily frustrated. Just like R-Type, it will happily leave you bashing your ship against a virtual wall, bereft of power-ups, and hopelessly underpowered against impossibly tough enemies if you have the temerity to die even once. Definitely a very good shooter, but you better be ready for it. We've got another rock-hard shoot-em-up next in line, but for me, this one is better than Image Fight. In fact, it's one of the best games in this whole video. It's another Nazca joint, and this time it's 1993's In the Hunt. Much like Gunforce 2, this is part of the DAS tetralogy. The idea behind these games is that they all share a common enemy in the shape of a group that's ruined the Earth by melting the polar ice caps, but you take that group on in different ways. And In the Hunt sees us going into the deep, piloting the Granvia submarine and preventing the society from ruining the world even further with another doomsday device. In the Hunt plays a lot differently from normal horizontal shooters. Its creator, Kazuma Kujo, didn't much like the auto-scrolling in most horizontal shoot-em-ups, and so he made a game that didn't have it, kind of like an earlier Irem game we'll be covering later called Mr. Heli. It turns out pretty well, actually, and if anything makes for an even harder game than the norm, one that just throws everything and the kitchen sink at you, usually also requiring you to navigate through traps and all sorts of tight passages while dealing with the enemy. Now, the difficulty level isn't that surprising when you consider that Kazuma's all-time favourite shooter is apparently the previous game we covered, Image Fight. When he joined Irem, he studied the design documents for that game intensely, and it certainly helped inform the games that he would go on to make himself. And of course, like all these other late period Irem titles, the game is just absolutely gorgeous. This is a pretty well-known game nowadays, probably more so than it was back when it originally came out, so no doubt there's going to be a lot of love for it. But obviously, if you've never had a proper play of In the Hunt, it's highly recommended. We now go all the way back to early 1979 for the first Irem game that we can play, back when they were still called IPM. It's IPM Invader. And yes, it's a Space Invaders clone, actually one of the more famous and better performing ones. There are a few changes, mind. The immediately noticeable one is the font, which is different to the original and essentially the same one you would find in Namco or Atari titles. The other big differences are a coffee break, a little cutscene you get after every third wave, might actually be the first cutscene in arcade history, that, and also a gameplay edition that you can enable with dip switches called capsules. These are dropped by the UFO and they hatch into additional aliens. Other than that, it's pretty typical Invaders play, and certainly not a bad clone, even if it is a whole lot cruder. The hardware it's running on is different. Again though, this was actually quite successful. As we mentioned previously, the game centres were so popular and so in demand, and the operators wanted as many Space Invaders-esque games as possible. So yes, something like IPM Invader would actually do quite well in such a market. If IPM Invader hadn't been an initial success, then well, chances are we might not be doing this video at all. One other little thing. As the popularity of IPM Invader naturally waned over time, it became something of a cudgel for Naneo, IPM's parent company, to beat the original founder Kenzo Sugimoto over the head with. He was blamed for the game's decrease in popularity and the company's failure to produce a similarly successful game, and it seems as though that eventually resulted in his ousting from IPM and Naneo taking over the company outright. A ruthless move indeed, but well, we wouldn't have Capcom without that happening, would we? Here's another early game, and one with quite a cool title. Now, to just call a game World War III would be kind of generic and boring, but Irem declares World War III? That's much better. This 1981 single-screen shooter has 3 separate stages for each country you defend. In the first you have to take out 20 bombers before the time reaches 11 AM. Pretty standard stuff. The second stage introduces choppers, and they're a bit tougher. You've got to avoid the big explosions from the bombs that they drop, and you've got to take all these out by 4 PM. Now, if you fail to complete both of these stages in the allotted time, you will have to deal with an MIRV, a whole load of nukes that have to be completely destroyed before a single one of them touches the ground. Now, the third stage is kind of different, a night stage where you can't fully see the bombers, but you have 2 searchlights to help you out. Again, it's crude and, for the most part, not a particularly original title, aside from the third stage, but it's an okay enough shooter. You might also know this game as Red Alert, depending on where you are. This next entry is actually correcting a little mistake from a previous video. I included Kid Niki in the 1980s Data East arcade list as a game they published. However, they actually only published the NES version of the game in the States, whereas the arcade version, the one that officially never left Japan, was fully published and developed by Irem. Anyway, my opinion of this 1986 game hasn't changed a whole lot. It's a really good and rather personable platformer, complete with a cool sword-twirling hero and some rather amusing bosses. Much like the later Hammerin Harry, Kid Niki spawned a whole series of console games that are also worth looking into, the majority of which never left Japan. But the arcade original is most definitely worth playing, and it did also get a pretty decent NES port. I wouldn't go anywhere near the C64 version of the game, mind you. Avoid that like the plague. While it's unfortunate that in a lot of cases we don't really know the true names of so many of the people who created Irem's amazing games, we most definitely do know this next guy. Hell, we already looked at several Piston Takashi Nishiyama games in the last video. He was pretty damn important at Capcom, but Irem is where he first made his name. Hell, he's the guy who really deserves a lot of credit for getting the company out of their initial period when they were largely creating unoriginal clones of the likes of Space Invaders and Galaxian, and took them up a whole load of notches, creating groundbreaking titles that were all Irem's own. The first game of his that we look at here may well be his last one for Irem, but it is also his most important one. And of course, it's 1984's Kung Fu Master. The game was seen by Nishiyama as something of a progression from his previous smash, Moon Patrol, which we'll be looking at later, with the initial design thought being to replace the shells of that game with fists and feet. And in doing this, Nishiyama pioneered the classic arcade beat-em-up. Simply put, there wasn't much at all like Kung Fu Master when it came out. To then go ahead and wrap this up with much more narrative than you would usually see in an arcade game, one very much inspired by Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee films of course, complete with Guardians and the different levels of the Devil's Temple. This one is a complete game changer. It is pretty telling that, like 10-Yard Fight, Nintendo saw bringing this game to the Famicom as being so freaking important that not only did they handle it themselves, they assigned Shigeru Miyamoto the task of heading it up, with the result selling millions. It goes without saying that Kung Fu Master, or Spartan X, is one of the most important games in this whole video. And not only that, it's just as playable as it was back in its prime. A Hall of Famer. We'll be covering the proper sequel to Kung Fu Master in the next entry. However, Vigilante wasn't actually Irem's first attempt at making a sequel to the game. In fact, we can even sort of play their first ill-fated try at it. Beyond Kung Fu is an unreleased game from 1986, and it was also seemingly known as Super Kung Fu Master at one point. The story here is that this board was acquired from an ex-Irem employee, and while it was dumped, unfortunately it was quite damaged. As we can see here, only the main sprites are visible in the version on MAME, and I presume that's unlikely to change unless, somehow, another board of this exists. The story goes that Irem did location test Beyond Kung Fu, but they weren't hugely impressed with the results, and they decided to go in a different direction, opting to make Kung Fu Master's sequel a bit more Americanized. And of course, Vigilante was the result. But while there's not a whole lot to see here, it's cool to at least catch a fleeting glimpse of Irem's first shot. You may well think that Vigilante coming 4 years after the original Kung Fu Master isn't necessarily something that's going to work in its favour. It's 1988 after all, 9 months after the release of Double Dragon, and we've got a more classic side-scrolling beat-em-up here, still on that single plane. That and, of course, Takashi Nishiyama isn't at the helm. He'd long ago left for Capcom, and in fact pretty much knew that he was jumping ship before the original Kung Fu Master was completed. Still, the core quality of that game is very much present. Vigilante may not exactly feel like a cutting-edge title in 1988, but it's most certainly a damn good one. Again, you've got enemies coming at you left and right, plenty more obstacles to overcome, big bosses to get in your way, the addition of nunchucks that'll help you do even more damage to these street toughs, and there's a Madonna to rescue as well. The graphics are also still pretty nice. That aforementioned Americanization comes off pretty well. So yeah, Vigilante is a decent sequel, and very much worth playing. Nowhere near the fame and impact of the original, but still a jolly good bash. Here is a pretty cool and underrated title from 1989, Legend of Hero Tonma. It doesn't seem as though this original arcade version left Japan, although the PC Engine version did come to the States. Now what we have here is probably best described as a platform run and gun that's a fair bit like Ghosts and Goblins, but with a considerably lighter touch on the graphics front, much more cutesy with a rather strange looking hero. People tend to go either way on the graphics in this game, especially when it comes to how the hero looks. He's got a bit of the old super deformed about him, but I personally quite like it. Anywho, Tonma chucks a lot of fireballs all over the shop, spewing them endlessly from his finger. And, much like Kid Niki, he falls in a single hit, so you best make the most of the firepower that you've got. Yeah, this is quite the challenging game, just what you would expect from Irem, really. It's certainly not a title that's enjoyed by everyone, but I dig Tonma a whole lot. (1991's) Lethal Thunder, or Thunder Blaster, is far from the best known of Irem's shoot-em-ups. In fact, it seems like this one might have taken quite a long time to be fully emulated in MAME. But hey, it is a cool one. It kinda reminds me a bit of Compile or Toaplan's shooters, which probably mostly has to do with weapons like the multiple laser that tends to take different shapes. The game also provides an incentive for you to do the traditional thing and hammer that fire button like nobody's business. The faster you fire, the more powerful your weapon becomes, which is cool. The boss battles are also a little different in that they're timed. Naturally, you've got to try and defeat these big old guardians before they escape. If they do escape, you don't have to face off against them again. However, their escape does apparently affect the ending you get, presumably negatively. This is a decent shooter, really, just as good and just as intense as the likes of Air Duel and Image Fight. We're staying in 1991 for the next game, Lightning Swords, also known as Kengo in Japan. It's another side-scroller and another quite obscure one. I don't think this is even as well known as Legend of Hero Tonma. This one is rooted in classic Japanese feudal-themed fantasy and mythology. You're a master swordsman able to charge up your blade and release hefty attacks against the hordes of ninjas, samurais and other warriors that are going to be getting in your way. The play is a little bit Rastan and also a little bit of Irem's earlier Ninja Spirit, another game we'll be covering later, while the graphics, though good, are also a bit more cleaner than the norm for Irem. There is a reason for this, one that is well explained by HG101 on their page for the game. This is one of a few arcade games that weren't developed directly by Irem, but were actually developed by the studios of their parent company, Nanao, and the graphics for these games tend to be a bit brighter than that of Irem's. Nanao took over the company back in the 70s, and they also owned another company called Tamtex, who were largely responsible for porting Irem's arcade games over to the Famicom and the Game Boy, as well as making original titles for those systems under the Irem name. All a little intriguing, and hopefully that tells you a bit more about the inner workings of the company while footage of this actually not half bad hack and slasher plays out. Still, if you want something that is definitely odd about Irem, look no further than this. One of their biggest games was an arcade version of a title that was originally made in America and released by Broderbund for the Apple II. The original Lode Runner had already performed very well on its 1983 release in America, but it really caught fire in Japan when it came out there in 1984. Funnily enough, Irem's arcade version and Hudson Soft's Famicom version both arrived in July of that year, and they would both be monster smashers. Although to be fair, the Famicom version does kind of take the main prize, seeing as that sold well over 1 million copies. So yeah, this was pretty important. Doug Smith's seminal platformer was the first Western computer game to break Japan. A lot of the credit for bringing the game over has to go to another very important Irem employee who we've not really mentioned yet. Kenji Scott Samura, who was with Irem virtually from the beginning, was the producer on most of Irem's late 70s to mid 80s games, and forged a relationship with Broderbund and its founder, Doug Carlston, that led to the acquisition of games like Lode Runner and Spelunker, and ultimately saw him move over to the States. Irem released 4 Lode Runner games to the arcade, and this first one features 24 levels from the original. Now, if you've never played this, then the goal is to get all that treasure and then leave the stage via the ladder that appears on the top, all while avoiding the bungling Empire's guards that are chasing you. You can also trap these guys in the ground with your shovel, making this game something of an evolution of Universal's Space Panic from 1980. The key to the game is understanding how those pesky enemies work, for they certainly don't just move around randomly. They're chasing you, although often doing so in ways that, unless you can predict them some ways in advance, will ultimately trap you. They don't necessarily take the most direct path. The intelligence that is on display here sure does make it satisfying when you manage to successfully predict where they're going to go, and especially in later levels, the paths you take to avoid them can be rather intricate. Honestly, this is glorious. One of the best computer games, it still holds up so well, and it works absolutely anywhere. Lode Runner is as great in the arcade as it is anywhere else. Irem released 3 more Lode Runner arcades in pretty quick succession. As you might expect, they don't screw too much with a winning formula. Lode Runner The Bungling Strikes Back from early 1985 is more of the same. You've got 30 levels here, 10 of which are taken from the original game, and the other 20 are either brand new or remixed takes on original levels. It's all good. Largely the same thing can be said about the third game, Lode Runner Golden Labyrinth, which came out later in 1985. The graphics aren't any different, but it's another 30 levels for fans of the game to lap up. One thing you will find is that the difficulty certainly creeps up as we go. Golden Labyrinth throws some pretty damn tough and complex levels at you right from the off, whereas the first game at least eased you in somewhat. But then that is kind of what you got on the Famicom too, where the original was followed by the ultra-difficult Championship Lode Runner, a game red flagged for experts only. Finally, in 1986 we have Lode Runner Teikoku Kara no Dashatsu, which translates to Escape from the Empire. This one didn't leave Japan. The graphics do get changed ever so slightly for this fourth and final arcade release, but mostly it's the same deal, another 30 levels for players to have a go at. Now, while it would be 14 years between this and the next Lode Runner arcade game, there would be plenty more titles released in the home, and most of them were made in Japan. Pachinko, harmless distraction or societal plague? Such questions tend to be beyond the purview of a silly little video like this, but we don't tend to see much pachinko in these Japanese arcade vids, certainly not as much as we see Mahjong. Not exactly surprising, seeing as classic pachinko machines can hardly be properly emulated in MAME, with all those balls flying around and clacking against each other. However, we do have an arcade game here that takes pachinko and tries to make a proper game of skill out of it. This is 1985's Lot Lot, and it's kind of interesting. The idea here is that balls gradually come down and make their way into these compartments, and you swap the compartments that the balls are in using 2 arrows. You control the first one, and the second one then follows your movements on a 4-second delay. If you reach a target score and don't lose too many balls to the out area, you win. This is a unique and cool concept, and it does make for a game that will get your head spinning as you try and master that second arrow's lag. It may seem so very simple on the graphical front, but this is not a puzzler to be messed with by any means. I am not awfully good at this one, but I can definitely appreciate it. It is trying to be very different from the norm, even if it is also co-opting one of Japan's most popular forms of gambling. It's sports time, and it's time to spoil a good walk. Yep, we're playing golf. IWM have 2 golf games which we're playing now, and they're both pretty good. First up, here's Major Title from 1990. Generally this plays a lot like the usual golf game, although the meter here is a bit different. The pointer's always going up and down, and ideally you stop it on the little green line to get the best shot, while staying away from the red. Also, you can push the power bar one step further from what appears to be the max. This will be an awesome shot indeed if you get it right, although obviously it's a lot harder to time the strike if you do this. If you score birdies and the like, you'll add more holes to your playtime, whereas if you score bogeys, naturally you'll lose holes and probably have to put another credit in. This is a pretty strong arcade golf game indeed, and one I have some fond memories of playing back in the day. It's certainly as good as the golf games you could get in the home back then. Major Title II Tournament Leader came out 2 years later in 1992, and in the West it's known as Irem Skins Game. The gameplay is largely very similar to the first, but you get more choice here. Firstly, you can pick one of 2 courses, and then there's 4 different players to choose from: Golf Pro, Technician, Power Player, and Magician. There's also a few more voice samples, and those golf players do look a fair bit more detailed. All of this is very nice indeed, and Major Title 2 is certainly the game that you should go and play out of these 2 titles. But really, they're the precursor to something utterly magical. Both major title games were designed by the ever-mysterious Kinte, the guy who most famously planned R-Type. Kinte and his team were amongst the ex-Irem employees who'd go on to join Nazca, and it's here where he would create his golfing magnum opus, 1996's Neo Turf Masters, which isn't just the greatest golfing game ever made, it's one of the best sports games ever made. Hell, it's one of the best arcade games ever made. What a legend. This man planned both R-Type and Neo Turf Masters, two of the greatest cabinets known to mankind. Still, mainly thanks to the outstanding research from K&O Industries over on Blue Sky, we do likely have a name for him, Mitsuo Kawai. Anyway, Major Title 2 is a pretty damn excellent golf game in its own right, even if it did lead to something far superior. Piecing together Irem's complete softography can be a little challenging, as there's a few companies scattered around all over the shop. You've got the regular Irem games, you've got the early games released by IPM, one game actually released under the parent company Neneo's name, a game that was picked up by Data East, and here we have two games that were actually released under Tamtex, who I mentioned a few entries ago as the guys who largely handled Irem's Famicom and Game Boy games. The games in question are Match It 1 and 2 from 1989 and 1993 respectively, and I think the reason why these came out under Tamtex is because they were a little bit more grown up. What we've got here is classic Sichuan-style Mahjong, you know, Shanghai, Solitaire, whatever, and you get matching those tiles in the traditional fashion. Once you complete a couple of grids, more than likely sticking a couple more coins in along the way to increase your time, you'll get a display of the woman in the background. I couldn't be bothered to get that far, but a quick glance at a long play video shows that they end up scantily clad as opposed to the full Monty. Not much else to say, really. It's the sort of arcade game you can imagine hanging around in the corner of an old hostess bar or love hotel, and there's obviously many other games like this one. Meikyuujima from 1988 is a game that never left Japan, at least not in its arcade form. The Famicom version of this game did get released overseas on the NES, where it was known as Kickle Cubicle. This single screen game is a bit of a variant on Pengo. You've got blocks of ice that you can kick about, only here the goal is usually to create bridges and whatnot that will allow you to pick up the treasure, as opposed to simply taking out enemies. Really, it's more of a puzzle game than anything else. This is, again, a much brighter and cuter game than the Irem norm. Such cutesy titles aren't exactly what they usually do, and once again Meikyuujima is a title that was created by Neneo Studios, as opposed to Irem. It's okay, on the whole. I can't say this is a game that majorly grabbed me, but then I'm not exactly brilliant at Pengo and, well, I'm far worse at this title, that's for sure. Moon Patrol is another significant title. This 1982 game from Takashi Nishiyama was, as we mentioned back when we did Kung Fu Master, one of the games that made Irem stand out as something more than just a studio that produced unoriginal clones. You play as a space cop, travelling through different sectors in this vehicle-based platformer. You jump over the various craters, you fire shells in front of you to get rid of rocks and other obstacles, fire missiles to take out the ships up above that are trying to blow you up or create more craters for you to overcome. There's a fair bit going on, and there wasn't an awful lot like Moon Patrol in the arcade when it came out. It's also notable on the graphical front. Although there were some cruder examples in the arcade before Moon Patrol, this game was one of the first to employ proper parallax scrolling, and that looks pretty damn nice. Most importantly of all perhaps is that Moon Patrol, alongside Konami's Scramble, was one of the first arcade games that was more about getting from A to Z, travelling through the sectors and reaching an ending, as opposed to simply cycling through stages and getting as high a score as possible. Back in the day, this sort of game was referred to as a cross-country title, and it also allows players to use continues if they're really desperate to see what's at the end. Now, Moon Patrol certainly wasn't the first game to use continues, but it was one of the earliest ones. When you consider the impact that this game had on platforming, and that it played a big part in the origin of the run and gun genre, and that Nishiyama also used his work here as the basis for what he would do with Kung Fu Master, Moon Patrol has to go down as a seriously important arcade game. To be honest, it's a lot more important than it usually gets credit for, and it's still damn good today. The funny thing is, as successful as Moon Patrol was, shockingly, I didn't actually know until making this video here that the game had a sequel in the arcade. 1985's Horizon just seems to have fallen through the cracks somewhat, which is a bit of a shame as it's not bad at all. What we have here is best described as a multi-lane take on Moon Patrol. There's 3 lanes that your buggy can jump to and from, and instead of simply jumping on the lane that you're on, you have to jump to a different lane in order to avoid obstacles. This can be quite challenging, especially as you've got enemies coming at you from the front and the rear to go along with the ships up top. One neat little feature is that there are subtle changes in the music depending on what lane you're in. The drums are more prominent when you're in the closest lane. Now, while I didn't know of this game until recently, it does remind me a fair bit of a game called Shockwave Rider that I used to play on the old ZX Spectrum back in the day. That's got pretty similar multi-lane gameplay, to the point where I wonder if the guys who made that game ever played Horizon beforehand. Still, details on Horizon seem to be kind of murky. I'm not sure if this game ever left Japan, and it doesn't appear as though it did, at least not officially. It's a shame if it didn't, although the arcade landscape was a bit different in 1985 compared to where it was when Moon Patrol came out. That was right in the middle of the golden age, and Horizon came out a little after everything went tits up. Perhaps that's why this game just doesn't seem to be very well known. Mr. Heli is another fine entry from Irem into the world of shoot-em-ups. This one was known as Battle Chopper in the States, but it was known as Mr. Heli everywhere else, including Europe, so I'm sticking with that name. This 1987 game is in many ways an entry into the shoot-em-up genre, right up there with the likes of Fantasy Zone and Twinbee, but it is pretty different to those games. Much like the later In the Hunt, this game doesn't auto-scroll, meaning that you can take your time a fair bit. Useful, especially seeing as a big part of this game involves blowing up rocks and mining for money and power-ups. And once again, you'll need all the help you can get. Like so many of Irem's shoot-em-ups in particular, Mr. Heli has a savage difficulty level. This company simply doesn't make shooters for beginners, as amusingly wholesome as this game might look. But even if it is tough, the game was popular enough to often be referenced by later Irem games, and to inspire the odd title of its own, such as Psygnosis's Blood Money. The game was definitely quite popular over in Europe, getting a bunch of conversions to the old 8-bit micros. Damn good game indeed, this one. The shooting action continues, although this game's not very famous at all. This is Mystic Riders from 1992. This is another cutesier shooter, one where you can choose between 2 witches, grab a broom, charge up those shots, and deal with various nasty little spectres. Apparently this game's from many of the same folks who worked on Hammerin Harry, according to Hardcore Gaming 101, so not the usual shoot-em-up team by any stretch. If you know your shooters, then Mystic Riders probably makes you think a fair bit about another game from this time, that being Successor's original Cotton, which was released in 1991. And yeah, they certainly do appear quite similar to each other. In truth, both are pretty well made, and I wouldn't kick either of them out of my arcade, although Cotton is the one that would end up with a whole series of titles in the arcade and elsewhere, while Mystic Riders was one and done, never leaving the floor. Definitely a neat little curiosity of a shoot-em-up, one that deserves a little whirl, especially if you're one for shoot-em-ups that don't just endlessly take place in the old final frontier or in some war or what have you. Next, we have another absolutely brilliant game, and one that a lot of people do seem to know now. It was initially a pretty late game from Irem, and not necessarily a successful one when it made its initial bow in 1993, but in the end, well, how can a game like Ninja Baseball Batman possibly stay ignored? I mean, just look at the damned thing. You're playing as these frickin' robot baseball ninjas, and the Commissioner of Baseball has tasked you with retrieving legendary artifacts from the Hall of Fame that have been half-inched by an evil baseball gang. What an incredible concept. It doesn't get more beautifully weird than that, but what's even better is that the game is a home run on the gameplay front, being an absolutely wonderful beat-em-up, endlessly inventive, doesn't ever let up at all. It's one of the best games in the whole genre. You simply don't want to stop playing it just to see where it's going to go next. And it's not exactly a whopping great coin sucker either. Now the funny thing about this title is that people would likely automatically point to Ninja Baseball Batman as an example of just how weird and wonderful those crazy little Japanese arcade games can get. I mean, where else would you get such a beat 'em up? And yet, the whole idea for the game was conceived by an American, a man named Drew Maniscalco, who worked in Irem's American offices and was initially inspired by the success of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. He created the big idea, making all the characters and so on, and eventually a team including Shinichi Hamada, who would later be a part of NASCAR working on Metal Slug, did the game. What awesome stuff. An all-time great beat-em-up, and one wonders if we may see a sequel one of these days. It has been rumoured that a Korean company named CRT Games is working on one, although not much has been heard about it for the last couple of years. Few classic beat-em-ups deserve a glorious revival as much as this one does, it must be said. We're sticking with ninjas for the next game, although this one is a bit more traditional, and it is another pretty well-known Irem game. Here's Ninja Spirit from 1988. Avenge your dad and slice up all sorts of demons. It's traditional ninja fare and it's very well executed indeed, even if it is also brutally hard. The key to the game is that you've got 4 weapons at your disposal, all of which can be powered up. There's your typical sword, shurikens, bombs, and a sickle or kusarigama. And yeah, you're going to need them all. Ideally, you're going to want them to all be powered up. A powered up sword, for example, creates a big old arc that you can use to deflect the many shots that come your way. You also can power yourself up with shadows that duplicate your movement, meaning that once you get a few boosts, you'll be laying down a pretty considerable amount of power. In many ways, this is a platformer with the mechanics of a shoot-em-up, and much like that sort of game, if a single blade or shuriken or anything penetrates your defences, you'll die, and you'll be right back at square one. Depending on the checkpoint, being left with absolutely nothing but your base loadout can be utterly brutal. But that is often the way with Irem's games. Of course, we've still got the most popular and most notorious example of this sort of play coming in just a few entries' time. If you can handle that difficulty, and if you're patient enough to take those falls, then Ninja Spirit will reward you with a damn good time, as it's a speedy, deep and pretty intricate platformer for 1988. It's certainly a game that I enjoy a lot, but it most definitely isn't one for the faint of heart. We're going back to the early days. Here's Panther from 1980. This is another single-screen shooter, albeit one with a little twist. You play as a tank, and you can only move left or right, firing shells at the enemies and trying to stop them from reaching the bottom of the screen. The gimmick here is that you don't just fire the shells directly in front of them. They're more like mortars, and you have to control their distance, landing them right on top of those tanks. On the cabinet, you would do this by using a throttle that's got the fire button on the side, and admittedly this can be rather tricky to get to grips with when you're playing the game in MAME. It's going to take a couple of tries and possibly a bit of tinkering with the usual configuration. Is it worth it? Yeah. This is certainly one of the most obscure Irem games. I can find almost no information about it whatsoever, so I can't imagine that it was successful in the slightest. If you want to play a tank game that's based around charging up a shell and judging its distance, I would recommend jumping forward a few years and playing Sega's excellent and thoroughly underrated Heavy Metal, as opposed to this game here. I always find that boxing, aside from the glorious success that was Nintendo's Punch-Out, has a bit of a tough time in the arcade. There's a few games out there, but the likes of Final Blow, Rinkin, Final Round, I don't know, they're all just pretty mediocre, to be honest. And now here's Irem's mediocre boxing game that I'm not likely to ever play again. This is Pound for Pound from 1990. The game takes place from a top-down view, which is a bit different at least, and the controls are also a bit different. You use a trackball and 2 buttons to launch those jabs, hooks and uppercuts, as well as occasionally shimmying forwards or backwards. Admittedly, this can make the game a tough one to play in MAME. I've certainly not got the controls set up right here, and that's on me. The top-down view isn't exactly impressive though. There's not an awful lot of arcade spectacle here, especially not for 1990. So yeah, this isn't a game I'd really bother too much with. It's one of the few whiffs in the Irem arcade library. On looking at the title, I was expecting Punchin' Kid to also be a boxing game of some description, perhaps a precursor to the previous game. And, well, that's exactly what I didn't get. In fact, this 1981 title is a maze game, just one of many games that were heavily inspired by Pac-Man. You may well have known this game as Oli-Boo-Chu in the States, but as that version wasn't published by Irem, I've opted for the original Japanese name. The point here is simple. You have to move around the maze and grab mice while also avoiding the fish-type fins that are after you, and obviously these mice move about rather than simply being stationary dots. There are bonuses kicking around that you can also grab, and oddly enough, despite this pink blob being all about the punching, there's no actual way that he can defend himself against the folks chasing him. No power pills or anything like that. In short, he's rather useless. The game isn't terrible or anything, but it doesn't exactly stand out amongst the reams of other titles out there that were taking pages from Namco's big yellow book. One thing that's quite handy about this video is that there's not an abundance of quiz or Mahjong games to trawl through and say virtually nothing about. In fact, there's just one of each of them. And first, we're looking at the quiz game. This is Quiz F1 1-2 Finish from 1992. Shockingly enough, it's themed around motorsports. Answer the questions correctly, get ahead of your rival, and ideally get into the points. The questions here are true or false, so I was at least able to answer a few more than normal, seeing as I had a 50% chance, but other than that there is, as normal, not really a whole lot to say. And here we go. It's funny. Probably the two most inconsequential games in this video are the quiz game and the Mahjong game, and what have we got in the middle of those two titles? Why, it's Irem's definitive series, the flagship, the one that, if you ask people what the first Irem game that springs to their mind is going to come up more than any other, even over Kung Fu Master. Yes, it's time for R-Type. an absolute arcade colossus, monstrously successful the world over, the first game in 1987 was the new champion of the shoot-'em-up genre. Such a white-hot product that even Nintendo, who had largely left arcades behind at this point aside from their Versus system and Play Choice 10 machines, were hungry for a piece of the action. They ended up distributing the arcade game in the States. As far as the arcades and the original Irem goes, we've got 4 games to look at here, 2 proper series entries and 2 spin-offs. And of course, it all starts with the 1987 original where you blast off and strike the evil Bido Empire. The general idea of the original R-Type, as told by Kinte and other members of the team in an interview for GameEst back in the day, was to make a shoot-'em-up that was, at every possible stage, a different beast to the then champion of the genre. That would have still been Konami's Gradius. And yeah, R-Type is a different beast in many ways, which is a credit to the team. Now while it appears as though Kinte was the planner, the lead designer was a man named Abiko. Thanks to K&O Industries, we know that this man's real name is Shinji Imada, and he also worked on Image Fight. You've got the Force Pod, the crucial addition to your ship that you get after you get the first power-up. You can attach it to the front and the back of the R9, it fires off the many weapons you can get, it absorbs bullets, and you can even use it as a more direct and brutal projectile if you want. Then of course you've got the tremendous, intricate levels, the absolutely huge boss fights and so on. Graphically, this is amazing, signifying another step up for the genre. A lot of that's down to new hardware. R-Type is the first game to use Irem's 16-bit M72 board, and it's a real showcase of just what this NEC V30 powered PCB can do. We've seen M72 at work already on a few games such as Dragon Breed, Hammerin Harry, Legend of Hero Tonma and Image Fight, and this is where it came to prominence. And of course, there's difficulty. Even compared to something like Gradius or other games in this video, R-Type is a frickin' monster. As always, death leaves you essentially naked, and depending on where you are, that can be a nightmare. Hell, even the famous battle against the first boss, the Deberikops, can be hell on earth if you go into it with virtually no power-ups. As brutal as it is though, people kept coming back. They wanted to get further, to see more of it, to see just what was coming next. What a game! One of the greatest and one of the most important shoot-'em-ups ever made, and what a journey for the company itself. Think about how many shoot-'em-ups we've seen from Irem already. They started out making crude clones of Space Invaders and the like, gradually got more praise and more success for original and innovative titles, and now, with R-Type, well, they became the best in the shmup business. Obviously, we are not done yet. R-Type 2 didn't come out immediately or anything like that. Instead, it hit the arcades in November of 1989, almost 2.5 years after the original's arcade arrival. The core gameplay of the title has had a few changes. You can now charge up your standard beam shot even further for an even more powerful attack, one that's certainly worth it if you've got the time to do it, and there may well be times when you need something that powerful, especially if you're low on power. So do you launch the old force pod for that, leaving yourself temporarily defenceless, or charge the beam, knowing that it's going to take more time? Decisions. You've got a few new weapons as well, and obviously you're going to need them. Once again, the difficulty level is utterly legendary, a game that will demolish you like a pig if you aren't playing on its goddamned time. And of course, it still looks freaking incredible. The big bosses and the stages are even more epic than they were before. Indeed, it was actually quite a long time before R-Type 2 got a properly accurate port to the home. That didn't happen until 1998's R-Types for the PlayStation. That said, Super R-Type for the SNES is based on it, but it rearranges a few levels while adding new ones. Of course, there's absolutely nothing wrong with more R-Type, and by and large, that's what we've got here with R-Type 2. Smashing. The next 2 games are considered to be spin-offs rather than part of the main canon, but they're both very much worth looking at. Firstly, here's 1991's Cosmic Cop. Also known as Armed Police Unit Gallop, I imagine a few people watching have been waiting for this one, wondering why it wasn't earlier on in the list. But yeah, it's an R-type game, even if in many ways it doesn't feel like one. We're on a planet for this game, and the idea is that you're facing off against criminal ships that have been driven mad by Libido. It feels like a loose connection, but according to Irem's official R-Type timeline, this game takes place at the same time as 1998's R-Type Delta. Anywho, this is an awesome shoot 'em up. The main sub-weapon at your disposal is a homing laser that you can use for a bit, but then need to charge up again, and obviously there's some other neat ordnance at your disposal, missiles, napalm and the like. The visuals here are, again, wonderful. This time they're really grimy, similar to later Irem games like In the Hunt and Gunforce, and it should come as no surprise that this is a Nazca title. Akio Oyabu was the main artist here. He previously worked with Kinte and Company on the original R-Type and R-Type 2, and he would go on to be the principal artist on In the Hunt and later the Metal Slug series. Already his work is looking pretty damn good on this game. Definitely give this one a try if you haven't done so. And finally, we have 1992's R-Type Leo. Now, why is this a spin-off and not part of the main series? Well, it's a damn good game, but there are a few notable differences. We're not up against Libido Empire, the graphics are a bit on the brighter side, the game is actually a little bit easier than usual, and we don't actually have the Force. Instead, we've got much stronger options that can either fire in front and behind you. So yeah, there's a few big differences here. A big part of this is that Leo wasn't worked on by the usual R-Type team. Instead, this was actually worked on at Naneo rather than Irem, same as other games we've seen like Lightning Swords. That doesn't mean we don't have a badass operator at the helm, mind. Atsushi Inaba was the planner for this game. Yes, the same fella who would later go on to be at the head of Capcom's Clover Studio and Platinum Games. This is his first game as a planner, but with this in mind it's no surprise that R-Type Leo is a damn good shoot 'em up, even if it doesn't feel exactly like an R-Type game. It does its own thing, but it does it very well. Even the plot is a bit unusual. At the time of Leo, humanity and Libido are actually at peace, and we've used this time to create Project Paradise, a system designed to make everything beautiful, run by a supercomputer called Eden, which naturally malfunctions and starts attacking us. Intriguing, isn't it? More of an RPG-esque storyline. Hell, with a bit of tweaking, it could be an arcade shoot-'em-up spin-off of Phantasy Star 2. Not a bad idea, that, actually. I wouldn't mind facing off against Dark Force in shoot-'em-up boss form. Anywho, R-Type Leo is pretty great. It's the last time that we would see R-Type in the arcades, although obviously it's not the end of the series by a long chalk. We've just covered the most brilliant, the most epic, the most glorious series of shoot-'em-ups, and what do we have next? Yep, it's Mahjong time. In fact, it's a Mahjong game from frickin' 1979. Oh, brother. This is Reach Mahjong, and shockingly enough, I actually have a fair bit more to say about this than the norm, as this isn't your usual arcade Mahjong title. It's actually a cross between Mahjong and Breakout. You get tiles through hitting them with a bat and ball, you create your initial hand, and then you spend the next rounds building up your tricks, your sets of flowers, bamboo, dots and so on. Discard tiles you don't want and then get to another one that you do. So yeah, this is a damn sight more playable for me than your average Mahjong game. If I knew more about the ins and outs of building a good Mahjong hand, maybe I'd be able to do okay at it. Neat little idea. One thing to note, this game, as well as some others we've seen like Green Beret and Head On, come with a prefix, PT. What does that mean? Anything special? Not really. PT stands for Play Table, meaning that this game would be housed in a cocktail cabinet. Just thought I'd quickly mention that. We've got another cutesy little puzzle game next. This is Risky Challenge from 1993. The idea here is that you have to work with this explorer, who also happens to be a baby, and he's gotten himself lost in this labyrinth. So you fill the area with blocks that he can walk on and also climb if they're in the shape of a staircase, hopefully guiding him to the exit before he either gets taken out by a monster or by the rising water levels. Bombs also pop up, which you can use to take out any block formations that might be getting in our neonatal adventurer's way. It's a cool concept, but I find this game to be pretty frustrating. While Irem's games as a rule do tend to be pretty hard, the irritating thing here is that while you often know exactly what you need to do, you seem to get screwed over endlessly by the incorrect blocks coming, or waiting for bombs that never come, and then before you know it you've got to just repeat the whole thing again. As much as this is the nature of the beast when it comes to a game like this one, I don't find this sort of gameplay to be particularly fun, and I wish that the stupid little shit at the bottom of that well had that teensy little bit more agency and wits about him. Hey ho, not a game for me, but that doesn't mean you won't like it. We've got 2 more games from the early days coming up. We're back in the world of somewhat crude and not wholly original single-screen shoot-em-ups. Sky Shooter from 1980 is as straightforward as it looks. You play as a slow-moving launcher, you've got to shoot down the planes that move left and right, and you've also got to take out any paratrooper that's coming down before they hit the ground and they wreck you. And, yeah, that's about it, really. Not an overly engaging example of the form. Irem declares World War III is a pretty similar game to this one, and there's a hell of a lot more going on in that title. They can't all be winners, I'm afraid. Space Beam from 1979 was actually published under the Nanao name as opposed to the Irem name, or rather IPM as it would have been at this time. I feel like I've played this sort of shoot 'em up a few times before. You've got a laser that charges up and you use that to make your way through the ship patterns, and it needs a couple of seconds to reach far enough to get the ships up the top. You're also up against an enemy ship that's got the same power. Mainly they're going to try and use their laser to defeat you, but you can also strike them down, and you can use the regular alien ships as cover. It's okay, I suppose. Another very early game that isn't particularly of note, but well, I can't exactly have this video without it. We've got to be thorough after all, and we've got to show as many games as we possibly can. So yeah, this is Space Beam. It exists and was possibly played at some time around 46 years ago. We've had Lode Runner, and now we've got another big American computer game that ended up becoming a hit in the arcades. It's time for Spelunker. Much like Lode Runner, Tim Martin's original Atari 8-bit game was published by Broderbund in 1983, and in 1985 it would make its way over to Japan. The very successful Famicom version was released in December, and this arcade version came out in February of 1986. It's based on the Famicom version, but with a few changes. So yeah, not only do we have a Japanese arcade game that started out life as an American computer game, we also have a version of the game that went from the home to the arcade, making Spelunker a very rare beast indeed. The whole idea of the title is to go down as far as you possibly can, picking up all the treasure, finding keys so that you can go further, bombing the odd rock, discovering hidden passages, and dealing with all sorts of obstacles, everything from tricky jumps to rather strange creatures. Generally speaking, this isn't an easy platformer, but this arcade version is a lot better and actually more forgiving than the Famicom one. I do quite like the console game, but it's great that falling more than 2 inches doesn't immediately kill you here in the arcade. Instead, it drains your energy a little faster, which is always going down and does need refilling with health potions from time to time. The whole concept of going down into the depths as opposed to simply going from left to right does give this a different feel to the majority of platformers, and that is something I really appreciate. If you're one of many people who've played the NES Spelunker and had a frustrating time with it, I recommend having a look at this arcade version, as you may appreciate it a lot more. There's also an arcade-only sequel. Spelunker II 23 no Kagi, or 23 Keys, came out later in 1986, and it's pretty different to the Spelunker II that came out on Famicom. While that console sequel really changed the gameplay a hell of a lot, the arcade sequel mostly provides more of the same sort of thing. We've got even more depths to sink to, and you may find yourself coming across icier parts of the cave, as well as bits that you can swim in. It's even possible to use bombs underwater, clearing the odd path and moving the water about. You can really see, with these arcade games in particular, just how huge an influence these games were on the almighty Spelunky. While it was obviously a big reference point, it is cool to see a lot of the little details that you would find in Spelunky also being present here in this much older title. If you like the first Spelunker, obviously you should have a go at this one as well. They both did pretty well in Japan. One thing that we haven't seen so far in this video is a good old-fashioned one-on-one fighting game, at least until now. Let's face it, it's the early 90s and basically everyone's got to try their hand at least once at making a game like this, and this here is Irem's attempt, 1993's Superior Soldiers. It's not exactly the most famous of the many fighters to come out in the wake of SF2, and it's not hard to see why. The gameplay isn't terrible, nowhere near as poor as something like Konami's Martial Champion or whatever, but it's kind of generic. The art style feels more in the vein of SNK than it does Capcom, which is perhaps appropriate seeing as this is another game worked on mostly by folks who'd make up Nazca, and obviously they'd almost exclusively work with SNK. The gameplay does feel more SF2-esque, mind you. Some characters, particularly the cool-looking blonde-haired dude with the glasses, pretty much just have the classic Shoto moveset, right down to fireballs and hurricane kicks. You can't exactly blame Irem for making the game, as back in 1993 the one-on-one fighter was the undisputed king of the arcade floor, but yeah, it's only so-so soldiers, I'm afraid. Here is a game that's a little more unique. Not necessarily good, but different. 1983's Tropical Angel is a water skiing game where you play as a lady and you've got to avoid rocks as well as the odd shark while scoring points via ramps, skating through buoys, or striking the odd pose. The concept here may stand out a little. Water skiing games aren't exactly common at any point in arcade history, let alone 1983, but I don't like playing this game at all. Each level, or test, consists of several sections marked by gates. If you hit a rock, you fall and lose a bit of time, and then you have to start the section again. You game over either when you run out of time, or if you hit a shark, which presumably eats you alive. The checkpoint style of play pretty much exposes Tropical Angel for exactly what it is, nothing but a rather shallow test of pure memorization, complete with controls that aren't exactly the most responsive in the world, and in the main it's just rather frustrating, really. Annoying in the extreme, especially when you endlessly get close to the end of one section only to get twatted by a stray rock, meaning you have to do it all over again. It's not really hard as such, it's just thoroughly unfun, and I can't recommend it. There are actually two versions of this game. New Tropical Angel also came out in 1983, and it's the same game except the courses are different. Not much else to say aside from that. I do not like either of them. You may recall earlier games in this video like Air Duel, Gun Force 2 and In the Hunt. All three of them are gems from the soon-to-be Nazca guys, and they're part of a loosely connected series called the DAS Tetralogy. It's been a little while, but here's the fourth entry in said series, and it's 1992's Undercover Cops. We're spitting on our fists and going deep, hitting the cobblestones and doing battle with Dr. Claiborne's thugs on a mission to restore law and order. Well, as much law and order as there can possibly be in a post-apocalyptic flooded world, anyway. Undercover Cops is a fantastic beat-em-up. I do prefer Ninja Baseball Batman, but this really isn't that far off. There is a definite sense of humour here, which I appreciate. It's quite funny to pull ridiculously large pillars out of the ground and twat enemies with them, and it's even more funny to beat the crap out of some ne'er-do-wells with a big old tuna fish. There's other amusing touches kicking about, like how the first boss battle is clearly inspired by the Terminator, complete with a crusher at the end of the stage that you can use to finish the fight early, if you knock the boss down there at the right time. Everything, as you would expect, is done to a turn. Deliciously grimy graphics, plenty of moves, all are crowds to control. This is just a frickin' awesome beat 'em up, one that you've got to play. Be a little bit careful though, there's actually 2 English versions of this. Game in Hell explains the changes quite succinctly. The world release of the original Undercover Cops is actually missing a few things compared to the Japanese one, for whatever reason. As such, it's not really the ideal one to play. It seems as though Irem knew this too, and so they released Undercover Cops Alpha Renewal later in 1992. Largely the same game, but moves and other things that were taken out of the English version are put back in. This one is kind of obscure and apparently only made its way to MAME in 2007, but Alpha Renewal is definitely the version that you want to play. We've got one more early single-screen shooter, and it's actually a bit more important than most of them. UniWar S, or Capsule Invader, hails from 1980, and it's got a pretty similar form to a lot of others we've seen. It's a Galaxian-esque game where you take on several different waves of ships, all with slightly different approaches and attacks. The quality here is a little less crude than some of the other early Irem games we've seen, which is nice, and that might have a little to do with the guy who planned it. This is actually Takashi Nishiyame's first arcade game. Obviously he wasn't credited on it, but he has mentioned it in interviews. Not a bad single screen game on the whole, not a classic, but it's made for an enjoyable 5 minutes, and obviously Nishiyama would go on to much better things following this little debut. We've got just a handful of games to go, and we've got one more really decent shoot 'em up. Here's 1989's X Multiply. There's a fair few similarities to R-Type here, as you might expect, but our ship's main weapon is actually a pair of tentacles that move around, defend the ship from errant shots, and lay down some serious firepower. As ever, you can do a hell of a lot of damage with these babies if you power them up, but obviously you'll lose all of that if you get taken down. According to the excellent research of K&O Industries on Blue Sky, it appears as though X Multiply may have been handled by the Naneo team as opposed to Irem, which is a little surprising. As K&O mentioned, this really does feel a hell of a lot like a full-on Irem game, and I wouldn't even have been that surprised if it turned out that the same folks who made R-Type worked on it. However, it appears that this was not the case. A fine job indeed for the Naneo people, and probably their best game alongside R-Type Leo. Usual Den is a 1986 game that, at least until very recently, didn't leave Japan, which is a bit surprising seeing as most of Irem's more actiony games do tend to get overseas releases. This one's got both top-down run-and-gun and regular shoot-'em-up action, and it's largely styled after Western fantasy and ancient Greek aesthetics. We've got soldiers, statues, dragons, the odd cyclops and what have you kicking around. It's a regular odyssey. Not a bad game at all, this one. I enjoy the mix of running around and then flying about, and once again I'm a little surprised it didn't leave Japan. However, it did recently get a Western release thanks to the almighty Arcade Archives, who always seem to crop up at one point or another in these vids. For its long overdue Western release, the Archive gave the game the new name of Heroic Episode, which feels pretty appropriate. Definitely worth a play. And here we are. It's the 68th and final game. I wasn't quite sure where to put this one, as it actually has two names. Initially it came out in 1983 under the name Traverse U.S.A, but was then quickly re-released as Zippy Race in the same year. I feel as though Zippy Race is the slightly more famous name thanks to the game's Famicom port, so I'm going to run with that one. This finale is pretty mediocre, as it goes. A rather early top-down racing game where you control a bike, you have to avoid the cars, and you make your way to the city. This can be kind of challenging as the cars are quite big, the roads are narrow, and it only takes the slightest touch to send you crashing, but at least you don't then have to start ages back at a checkpoint like you do in Tropical Angel. One kind of cool touch is that the game switches to a behind the bike view as you reach the end of a stage, giving you the impression that you're actually making your way into the city in question, as opposed to just hitting a goal line. Other than that, it's a rather standard affair, a bit like Battle Road, which we saw way back near the beginning of the video. But hey, riding into a city and reaching a goal does at least make for a cool ending visual. And with that, we have finished looking at all of Irem's arcade games. It is on the whole a pretty fantastic output. There are just so many classics here, some of the best shooters, some seriously groundbreaking games, and honestly not all that many flubs. A lot of the lesser known games are still worth playing, and there's only a couple here that I'd absolutely never want to touch again. Again, I really think that Irem are a bit underrated as far as the great arcade studios go. Sure, they've got a couple of seriously major titles, and I'm not just talking about those golf games. The likes of R-Type, Moon Patrol and Kung Fu Master rightly belong in any arcade hall of fame due to the impact they had. But then you've also got brilliant games like In the Hunt, Dragon Breed, Ninja Baseball Batman, Gun Force 2, Lode Runner, Ninja Spirit, Undercover Cops, the whole Irem Nazca connection, Hammerin Harry. There's just so much to love here, so many games that should absolutely be played by any arcade lover. Honestly, they're right up there, and it is a shame that the original Irem's arcade years stopped so abruptly in 1994. One does wonder how the original Irem would have fared with the transition from 2D to 3D. Indeed, perhaps that's the reason why Naneo decided to pull the plug, because they didn't think it was feasible with the resources they had. And yet, the crew at Irem would continue to fly that 2D flag, doing so successfully for years to come at Nazca, so perhaps it was a bit premature. Who knows? In any case, if you've only ever played the most famous Irem arcade games, well, get some of the titles you've seen here on. You are absolutely in for a treat. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now.